The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
So we are here today with Emma Wong, who is the Technology and Innovation Advisor at the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency. Emma, welcome to Titans.
All right, thank you, Olivia.
So it's really great to have you here today. I'm excited to learn all about what you're doing with the OECD. But before we do that, let's learn a little bit about you. Where'd you grow up and what did you study that sort of brought you to nuclear?
Oh, that's a long story. I hope you have a lot of time for this. I grew up in Michigan, actually, the Mitten State, right? Like out in the Midwest.
Where in Michigan?
Near Detroit.
Oh,
are you from Michigan?
My family's from Michigan. They're from all over the state, but the western side, so.
Oh, well, I won't hold that against you right now, but like on the eastern side, yeah. So my family is basically, I'm a child of the big three. If you know that, that means my father worked at General Motors. So the big three is the big three auto companies, right? So like, when you come from that, you're supposed to go into the auto industry, but obviously I am not in the auto industry right now. So as growing up, my dad was an engineer, and I was good at math and science. So everyone's like, oh, math and science, you should go into the sciences. And I really like chemistry. So I was like, okay, then chemistry plus engineer in my life means chemical engineer. And I had no idea what they did. I was like, it sounds like a good thing to do. And I was like, but I also like doing research. So I really was like into like learning, always continually learning. I got to the University of Michigan, so alma mater, and I was like, I'm going to get my chemical engineering degree. I think it's great. But then I looked around and they have in your intro to, your first year as a freshman, they want you to actually see all the different majors there are. So I actually was looking around and I saw that, there's like this thing called nuclear and radiological sciences. And I was very interested in that. And I was very close to double majoring in chemical engineering and nuclear engineering. But I didn't, because my parents were like, you need a career when you're done. You're going to be a chemical engineer. I'm like, okay, fine. But being, an independent, strong-willed woman, I was like, well, okay, but that means I'm going to have to just learn about what this nuclear thing is on my own, right? So what I did was I worked in a radiochemistry lab as an undergrad. And so I did a project in radiochemistry learning about uranium-239 and the separation of it to look at the gamma ray spectrum and what did that look like. So that was my first exposure into really nuclear science and what it could mean. And actually got one of my first papers published in that. So it was really exciting because I actually got to work at the Phoenix Memorial Lab. I got to do separation science. I got to actually devise my separation of these isotopes and then take spectra of it and then do the analysis myself. So I did all of these different things and I was like super fascinated by this. And then after that, one of my other undergrad projects I worked was in tissue engineering. I was dead set. I was going to be work in the medical field. I was going to save the world. I was going to create synthetic tissues. And so again, I was working with the Phoenix Memorial Lab. They had a test reactor there. And I was actually doing scission of different polymeric chains to try to figure out what the optimal was in order to grow like bone tissue. So I was like, oh, like nuclear can do so much besides just, this nuclear power thing we think about. Like there's so many other possibilities. So I was getting into nuclear science, into medicine. And I was completely sure this is what I wanted to do, right? And then in the back of my mind is my parents be like, you need to find a job, is nuclear really a thing? Okay, fine. So I went to grad school thinking I was going to go into like biomedical science. And in going there, I figured out a lot of things that were more practical in my life. And I was like, no, I want to really more focus on like materials research. And I want to more focus maybe like on something more near term, that it's really tangible to society, right? And biomedical science is that way, but when I entered it, and a lot of things that I was looking at looked a little bit further afield than I was like thinking about originally. So nuclear is in the back of my mind, but I was like, okay, materials do other things. There's like energy, blah, 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 right? And so interestingly enough, I worked at the Army Research Lab in Aberdeen, Maryland, under the ORISE program. So it's a governmental program to bring in postgraduates to see if you like these areas. And I was actually working in composite batteries, solid state composite batteries. So I was looking at systems analysis to see what types of materials would be the best, what kind of chemistries would be the best, and then doing a lot of material and functional testing of these batteries. And so, as you know today, energy storage is a big thing. Well, the Army was thinking about this a long time ago. Like, how do we get the best energy for the space and, have it to be also a multifunctional aspect to it? So I was already thinking about, okay, I'll go into energy or some sort of energy capture there. And then eventually I kind of grew out of my research phase, and I was like, I want to try to do something more impactful. Research, when you think about research, there's that technology readiness levels. You go from like 1 to 7 or 1 to 10, depending. Well, where I was sitting at in the Army Research Lab, I was definitely at a technology readiness level of like 2. That means you're going to be working on this for 20 years before you see it being implemented like anywhere. And it's on a good day. I mean, it could be, 5 or 10, but like reality is I'm probably going to be like doing the same experiment over and over again. And I wanted near term immediate impact, meaning like within a few years. Mm-hmm. So I then went job hunting again and was like, what do I want to do with my life? I've had all these interesting experiences, and it was either from Michigan, right? I'm either going back to the car industry and work on fuel cells, or I'm going to try this new thing in nuclear and like actually, try it out. Tell my parents I'm going to try this out as a career option and see if I like it. If not, I'll come back to, Michigan and live and work on the autos industry. And so I kind of got what I wanted, and I got to try it by going to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They're like, yeah, that sounds good. Sounds like a good career path. We don't know. My parents did not know much about it. So they were like, that seems safe. Yeah. Right. I was like, okay, that's great. You think it's safe? I'm going to try this. I'm going to learn as much as I can, learn as much as possible. I started off as a technical reviewer. I was a chemical engineer. So if you ever heard about a chemical engineer, you're very adaptable. You can learn a lot of different systems. A nuclear power plant is just like any other power plant. It just uses nuclear fuel to make the energy. So I was like, oh yeah, I can do this. Not a problem. I'll just learn this really quickly so I can then apply this kind of new wave of thinking. And then, I'll learn the regulation part. What I didn't realize is I really fell in love with it. I was like, regulation, there's a set of rules, there's a set of parameters you need to think about, and then you can start thinking about like, how do you risk inform this? How do you make it risk based? And so I kept progressing through my career. I was like, I was learning so much. I actually got to visit, audit, and inspect nuclear power plants. So I got on the ground, did some hands-on. I didn't get to repair anything, but I got to actually ask a lot of questions, got to explore around, got a full experience. Mm-hmm. And from there, I was like, I want to do more in this industry. I was like, I'm regulating it. I'm making sure the public health and safety is first and foremost. Now that I've been able to like review so much, get under the hood, so to speak, of like these plants themselves, as a regulator, you get to see and ask questions about anything. I was a firm believer that yes, nuclear power needs to be there. It needs someone to like actually be able to do those evaluations, to push it forward, to be innovative.
Mhm.
And so, however, when I first started that, I think it was in 2007, and then, you know, that was in the height of the nuclear so-called renaissance back then. So I lived through the height of the renaissance, and then I went through, and then there was kind of like this lull, as we all know. There was like, oh no, what's happening? The renaissance doesn't look real. And so at that point, I was like, okay, this is interesting. I'm working on operating reactors. I've worked on relicensing. I did the initial licenses to 40 years of operation, and relicensing now was from 40 to 60 years. And then I started on, you know, looking at subsequent license renewal that was going out to 80 years. But I was like, okay, that's interesting and all, but like, I need a challenge. What's the next thing? And you won't think this is interesting, but I found it interesting, is like the back end of the fuel cycle. Where does everything go?
That's fascinating. Yeah.
After you're finished, right? Like, so I was like, well, I'm going to learn about this. So I went over to, you know, the back end side, you know, dry storage and transportation. It's basically the long-term storage of spent fuel. Like, what do you do with this after it's done? And so I learned a lot about the regulation, how it's stored, how it's transported. And it was absolutely fascinating. So like, for me, it was like starting to complete that full picture, right? Like, I've operated this now, you're going into decommissioning, you're going into like, where does this go? So I was like, I'm learning so much. You know, I also participated in like trying to revamp the regulatory and licensing processes in that area. And so like, I got to participate in rulemakings. How do you update guidance? I actually got to kind of update rules as well, which is, how many times can you say you've updated a rule, right? Like, I was like, oh, this is fascinating. I've never knew how any of this worked. And then after that, I was just like, I'm going through it. Believe me, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, I have very fond memories. I thought it was great. And then I needed that next challenge, right? As you can tell, I'm always looking for the next challenge.
Absolutely.
And so I then moved on to the Electric Power Research Institute. Like, I'm also getting back to my research roots, right? I've been a regulator for quite a while, going back to my research roots, and they hired me into doing long-term operations, which means going from 60 to 80 years of operation. Now, I had already worked very much on the, you know, going from 60 to 80 years of from 40 to 60 years of operation. Now we're going to go to 80 years of operation. I'm like, okay, I can think about this. I know how to do this.
Can you, sorry, just can you quickly
go ahead.
for those who maybe aren't quite as familiar, what EPRI's like role in the broader nuclear space is exactly?
Sure, of course. So EPRI is a nonprofit organization. It's a research organization, completely independent. And what they do is basically all of the utilities in the United States are members of EPRI. And most of the nuclear power plants, their utilities are also members around the world. So it's a global organization, very much international. So they participate in a lot of international discussions, writing international technical bases, and things like that. So there's a long story on how EPRI was created, but it was basically a need for research to be done for, you know, maintenance considerations, long-term longevity situations, and anything else at that point, right? And the kind of the premise of all of this is, if you think about it, like if you are an organization, say you're one utility, and you need to do research to say, okay, all of my materials in my plant, you know, will have this life, and I need to do this remediation or something like that, right? Your dollar, or however many dollars you have, will only go so far in how much research you can do. But say all of the power plants or all the utilities get together and pool all of their money together, how much more research could you get done with that money to further all of the research for the full industry? That was the premise of EPRI, and that's why it got started. Basically, what happened was there was a blackout in New York City, of course, in the summertime. And if you're in New York City, if you're in the summer, it is hot and humid. And they want to know why their electricity is not on.
Yeah, I remember that blackout. It was, not great.
So what do you say, right? Like, why are the power plants not running? So it's all about reliability. It's all about consistency. And so to do that, you need research and you need preventative measures to do that. And so basically EPRI was formed to help give that research and technical bases to do that.
And they, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not just nuclear. It's all different types of power plants that EPRI focuses on?
Correct. So EPRI started with nuclear and then spread out to all generation power generation systems, including like transmission and distribution. We even have an area looking at the environment, looking at equity, environmental justice. We have a whole technology innovations area. It's very dynamic. It's very exciting because if you are there, you can actually participate in anything to do with energy and electricity, and there is an expert there to answer any question you almost have.
Awesome.
Very
well, that's
exciting.
really cool. Okay, we'll keep going with your career because I didn't mean to cut you off on that.
Oh, no. Feel free to, if you haven't noticed, I could keep talking forever.
No, go ahead.
All on my own. Anyway, so I got to EPRI. They had me working on long-term operations, which meant 60 to 80 years of operations in the United States. Today, if you look in the news, you see things, it's been licensed already. Now we're only looking at the environmental part of that licensing, and soon, hopefully, they will work through that and do those evaluations. But when I started at EPRI, that long-term operations project had already been going on for many, many years, and it was getting to like that last hurdle. You see the finish line there. It's so close, but they needed someone to help push it over that line. And there were still some issues, and I don't even want to call them issues. They were just technical knowledge gaps that needed to be filled for the regulator to say, yes, I have confidence, we have enough knowledge that yes, you can operate up to 80 years of operation. And if something were to happen between, whenever you are now to that 80 years, there's enough time. We would have seen it before any safety problem would have actually occurred. So that's all about aging management. And so I was brought in to try to assist with that. And I really got into yes, these power plants, I don't see a reason why they can't operate till 80 years. If in the evaluation that each plant has to do individually shows that they can't, then of course, they're going to either, remediate whatever it is, really, or replace that part. They're going to put in more rigorous maintenance or inspection plans, or if it doesn't make economical sense, or they can just, retire and decommission the plant, right? It is the evaluation they need to do, each one needs to do to see if they can get to 80 years of operation. But what EPRI did, and what I was able to assist EPRI with, was to get together that technical basis, the technical information. We actually have 3 sets of what we call tools documents. There's electrical, mechanical, and civil structural tools in quotation, because they're just documents to help do that evaluation, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you can imagine a plant of anything, not even just nuclear, any plant, it's giant. If you're going to do an evaluation, if it's going to operate for a long time, how are you going to determine this without some sort of guidance, right? So that's kind of what EPRI did. They put together these tools documents to help anyone around the world do this evaluation. And I thought that was great. It's near term, immediate impact. I'm having an impact on power generation and hopefully energy security for around the world, right? I'm now at a global institution where I was, just in the United States, US NRC. Now I'm at a global institution, so I'm having an impact globally. I'm having conversations, with the Japanese, with the Europeans all over. I'm taking part at IAEA events. I'm having a big impact, which is kind of where I wanted to see my career go, is having larger and larger impact. to basically create energy I actually do believe that energy should be something that everyone has access to, right?
Yeah,
Like with
exactly.
water, right? So in order to do that, you need to make sure it's reliable and sustainable, and then make it available. So it's kind of like where you're going to see my career kind of moving in that direction. So that is one of my biggest accomplishments. I think it's to push that over the line, and actually having the courage at times to stand up and be like, this guidance that EPRI is writing right now, I think it's not clear enough. I walked in it with fresh eyes saying, as a regulator, I probably would have asked a few other questions. Maybe we might want to just address them in the documents now. Like it's an open document. There's no reason not to try to add a little bit more, to have a little bit more technical robustness at this point. And to that vein, I also challenged a lot of the EPRI staff. I'm like, how can we make this so anyone can use it and I don't need a PhD?
Exactly.
And in some areas, I was like, I should be able to understand this document.
Right.
If I can't, that means maybe we need to retool it so it's accessible to more people and they can use it, especially around the world, right? Because some things are just very technically dense. And so in challenging that, I found a lot of value in that myself, because then I'm like, okay, I'm adding value even though it's not my technical specialty. Additionally, another revelation I had, and one of the other impacts I had, was I looked at these documents and I'm like, okay, we're going out to 80 years. I'm like, what's special about the year 80?
Yeah.
There's nothing special about the year 80. It's like saying at 80, everything for some reason, you just kind of like everything turns gray and falls apart.
Yeah.
There's no such thing. When you're looking at the age or something aging, it always depends on like what materials are you using and what environment are you putting it in, right?
Right.
And so therefore everything is very site specific. So therefore the age has no bearing on anything. So I'm like, okay, all of these documents that say the technical basis is going to be guaranteed 80 years. I'm like, let's not write a year in here anymore. Let's just say that the critical parameter is X. And once you hit this, you need to do further evaluation. Why don't we be more scientific and less, because they say, what is it? Like the 50 is the new 40, the 40 is the new 30. Like,
yeah.
Like, I'm like, okay, it's nuclear power plants, 80 is the new 60.
Right. Yeah. Why are we holding everyone to this 80 when it like actually is like completely insignificant? Absolutely.
Absolutely. That's why I'm like, well, you can say nuclear power plants might be able to operate to 100, but like, why should I even say 100? It's whenever it's no longer feasible and economical to operate is when it should retire.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Okay, cool. Well, so how did you transition from your role to EPRI to what you're doing now with the OECD?
So at EPRI, the last job I did was I was actually the lead in nuclear innovation. So I was very much into innovation. I was trying to get everyone to be more innovative, try to change innovation culture. I participated and helped create some of the Global Forum for Nuclear Innovation that happened in 2022 in London. And it really opened my eyes to what the international stage really was, to how much impact you can have with just a voice and just kind of trying to change things. So with that, I was always thinking about like, how could I have more of an impact internationally, right? And at EPRI, I was already doing it on a technical basis, but I'm like, well, is there any way I could have more of an impact? And an opportunity came up to be on loan to the Nuclear Energy Agency here in Paris. I'm in Paris. And I kind of thought about it. I was like, well, this is a great opportunity. It is kind of a disruption in my life. And I thought, well, I'm kind of a disruptive type of person. I kind of want to drive things forward. I kind of want to, be different. And I want to create change, right? So how better than to create change and to try to instill change in myself and do something radically different than anyone would expect me to do and move to Paris. A lot of what they can focus on is, more international policy,
Right.
looking at things at even a bigger picture than I had ever seen them.
Yeah.
It was a new way of like thinking, changing how I saw things to, okay, I have now this opportunity to look at it through a lens of, there are emerging nuclear nations
Right.
that need advice. There are current powerhouses that have lots and lots of nuclear, right? And they've got a great voice. And like, how do we learn from them?
Mhm.
We have nations that are kind of in the middle. What do we want to do next? Maybe we're retiring them. Maybe we shouldn't retire them. Maybe we want new nuclear. Maybe we want, there's so many questions going around, and it's an easy way. And the NEA actually has this great convening power of bringing people together for coordination and collaboration to have these discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, especially in Europe, I think there's such a shift towards, prioritizing nuclear, all the way from sort of the EU level to the individual country level. Especially in Eastern Europe, we're seeing such a need for it right now that, it's such an interesting and important time to be, working on these topics.
Oh, completely agree with you. Like, I've only been at the NEA for 6 months now, working as, the technology and innovation advisor. And just being here and working and looking at all these different things, I have a very different perspective and appreciation on.
Absolutely. And I think that's why, international collaboration, especially at the regulatory level, is so important, because those differences in how we evaluate things and how we look at different conditions or factors based on, what's going on, in a certain country, or sort of how different individuals or different regulators evaluate different topics. Like, that's so important, because, it's going to allow us to think about, things in a way we might not have otherwise considered them.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, well, so let's talk a little bit about the SMR dashboard. This is a really incredible resource. I was just looking through it, last week, and there's so much information. So I would just first love to hear a little bit about like what, the SMR dashboard is, and sort of how it was originally conceived, or what the need was that it was trying to fulfill.
Dion Cameron, who is the head of my division, she really drove this one forward. What it really does at the heart of it is kind of show you visually, because a lot of people are visual people, which is very important to communicate and where they are, and tell parts of the story. So it's not just, we're saying, okay, this is where you are in your progress meter, but it also gives the context behind it. So the SMR dashboard, though, is a compilation of all the publicly available information out there that we could find. And I say that because we evaluated SMRs from around the world, and I am not an expert in Russian, in Czech, in Polish, and we had to use translator tools. We had to use, our experts, other experts here at the NEA to help us find information. So it's the publicly available information that we could find, because there may be some more out there. So that's really the basis behind it. So we use that publicly available information to look at and track progress of these SMRs towards deployment. They actually launched in October the SMR strategy. It actually outlines 6 enabling conditions for deployment. And so these 6 enabling conditions are the criteria that we developed and put together to do this evaluation and analysis. We start with licensing. So licensing kind of looks at, where are you in the stage of licensing? Are you kind of in pre-discussions? Have you submitted anything? Or have you already gotten some parts of it, approved? In different countries, their licensing schemes are very different. So, for instance, like the US, Canada, and UK, they're very different. Right. And so if you look at the criteria out there, it will actually, if you're from one of the countries, say Canada, like I think one of those criteria, like they'll never actually ever hit that criteria. They'll just go to the next one. And we're like, well, that's okay because we're trying to measure. It's not all completely linear. It's just where you are in the progress in your journey of licensing. And so if you go from, one part to and you skip a one, doesn't mean like you did it. It means this is where you are today, type of thing.
Right.
And it took my full team, which is probably about 10 members on the team right now, a lot of discussion with the member states, with other vendors, within ourselves to come up with that criteria that's in the document. It's the one with that matrix.
Yes.
And I will say, even as we were doing the evaluations, we were still refining that criteria to make sure it fit with the SMRs that were evaluated. Now, 21 SMRs were evaluated, so it was quite an undertaking. So the first one was licensing. The second one we looked at was siting. So how far are you along with citing an SMR, right? Like, because you can do all the work you want, but until you're like thinking about actually putting it somewhere, like a site, like, are you really progressing on your journey to deployment?
And in certain countries, those two things are interconnected, right? Like having a site, unlocks licensing opportunities, so they all work together in some ways.
Oh, yes. I will say a lot of these criteria are interconnected, which makes it quite interesting because it's like, can you do one without the other? And a lot of interesting insights did come out from doing an evaluation globally.
Right.
Because if you just did it in North America, you would think, okay, this is the stepwise how you have to do it. But it's only really applicable in that part of the world. If you were to do it, only like in Asia.
And how did you guys look at, or was there any consideration of like evaluation of first-time regulators versus regulators that have sort of a history of licensing nuclear power plants?
Unfortunately, for this first 21, there were no like real first-time regulators in the mix.
Got it.
Now, we're in our second phase of the project where we're looking at an additional 30 plus reactors. And there will be in this batch some first-time regulators. And I'm going to tell you, I have a list of now things I have to start considering because now it's not completely straightforward.
Absolutely. And to jump ahead a little bit, but not to jump ahead too much. How are you guys thinking about like fuel constraints and some of these, new issues we've been seeing with like, how the fuel supply chain is getting disrupted with, issues with Russia and things like that?
Oh, that's a great question. That is definitely a concern. And we have great members at the NEA and other areas who are thinking a lot about that and having those discussions on where is that fuel supply chain going to come from, as well as looking at, what other ways are there to look at the problem, right? That's a lot of the discussion that needs to happen is on supply chain. Supply chain of the fuel is going to be one of those hurdles that will need to be overcome. And it's going to take a lot of governments and private industry to come together and and utilities to have that really honest conversation on like, what are we going to do? What are we willing to commit to? If we want to say in the United States, you're kind of already seeing this, they're starting to commit to, okay, we're going to build some of these enrichment plants here in the United States.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, the United States government, Department of Energy really got behind Centrus. That was, publicly announced recently. I know they're working really hard on it, but it's also, I think one of the biggest challenges is like some of these things just take time. Enrichment is not a fast process. And it literally needs that time. So it's definitely something that I think is going to impact some of these timelines pretty significantly.
I think so, but an interesting thing is like we can't see into the future on what's actually going to happen globally. But for instance, to have a new supply chain of highly enriched fuel in a country, you kind of almost need commitments that there's going to be a buyer and a real demand for this fuel to actually spin it up. It's a centrifuge, right? But to spin this up, like you need to know that someone's going to buy your fuel.
No, that's completely right. And that's definitely something that needs to be thought about as we're making some of these long-term decisions.
And
Yeah.
it's definitely on the NEA's radar to have these conversations. Supply chain is one of those really big areas that needs to be focused on, especially in fuel.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the areas in the dashboard that I really found most interesting, because I think this is a topic that is so important, is the heat. You guys did ranges in sizes and temperatures for heat applications, specifically looking at how SMRs can be used for industrial decarbonization. I think this is such an interesting topic. How did you guys sort of decide that this was something you guys were going to focus on?
I'm glad you asked this question, because really what we did is we went to the member states. So the NEA has, countries are the member states, right? And so they actually got together and we asked them, what are these industrial use cases? What do we want to be looking at? And they actually came up with 11 of them. And this happened to be one of them that they ranked very highly. So we actually went out and had a discussion with the NEA members on what are the things that are most important for decarbonization, and this is where they came out. So this is the product, I guess you could say, from like having these international discussions at a high level on what are the priorities and then going after it, and actually then doing the analysis and pointing it out to people. These are the priorities of a lot of smart people getting together, and then let's have that focus and move forward with that.
Yeah, I mean, this is so fascinating, and I think, such a valuable resource. Industrial decarbonization is just not something we think about enough. And like how, and I mean, nuclear has this like unique aspect of being a way to create, zero carbon heat. And whether it's district heating or these applications, like I think it's just such an amazing aspect that maybe like from a communications perspective, we're not like championing that enough as one of nuclear's like most unique aspects. So another thing I wanted to talk to you about was this. I think it's really interesting the way you guys broke up the reactor configurations: land-based, multi-module, marine, and mobile. How did you guys sort of come up with those 4 categories, and how did you, especially when you think about like land-based versus multi-module? I mean, everyone calls themselves an SMR, but it's like, how did you guys define what is actually multi-module versus land-based?
Well, so land-based is kind of easy. Okay, so you can be land-based and multi-module. So you can actually fit multiple of
Gotcha.
the filters, right? So it's just because you're land-based doesn't mean you can't be multi-module. And so it's basically the information that comes from the vendors, right? Like obviously land-based, you can that's an easy one, right? You're on land. And there are some of the reactors in the dashboard itself that are marine-based. They're sitting in water, right? And they're actually already being built, and they're going to be sitting, on a ship. And then hooked up to the grid, which is super interesting. But the multi-module is interesting because you would think, well, a lot of these could be multi-module, right? But it's really what the vendors tell us if they intend it to be multi-module or not. So that's the modular part of it. I will say that a lot of people use SMR, I'm going to put it in quotations very loosely. And we have kind of just been on the definition of being more inclusive with that, and just because I personally have been seeing more governments just using SMR to mean anything that's kind of a little bit below mid-range, like so under like 300 megawatts electric, right? So it's anything beyond under that, I'm like, okay, that's probably just small, and then we just all use the SMR to go with it. So
super interesting. Well, I mean, so I guess what in terms of this resource, I mean, it's like a fascinating document. Is there any discussion about turning it into some sort of like interactive actual like dashboard online as a resource to sort of learn more about these different designs?
Yes. So the first priority though is that there are 80 plus SMRs being designed, and there's more and more every day, right? So the first our priority for the NEA right now is to just do that first baseline evaluation, right?
Right.
And then we're definitely want to move into putting it online. I can't say what that timeline would look like. Getting the analysis done is priority one.
Yeah, well, it's a really amazing resource, and I encourage everyone who's listening to go check it out, because it is there's so much information, and the way you guys are analyzing it is just really incredible, especially if you're a visual person. I know I really appreciated all the visuals in there. So for you broadly, like clearly you're very passionate about nuclear and the role it plays in enabling human prosperity. What is your vision for nuclear's future?
I think nuclear's future is very bright. I think that, with the new technologies we have out there, there is almost infinite possibility, right? They're even talking about space exploration, putting a reactor on the moon. So I think there's a universal need for nuclear to exist. I think if you ask me, the existing fleet's going to lead the way. It's going to bridge that gap between, until we can deploy that full suite of whatever the new reactor fleet is going to look like. So it's going to keep bridging it along until it's ready to go. The deployment of the new nuclear fleet, I think, is a lot closer than we think. However, what the dashboard does indicate is that there are probably some barriers that we as collectively, as a global community, could work together to maybe try to either figure out how to get past them, like supply chain of fuel. How are we going to get past that? Supply chain in general, workforce of the future. How are we going to train the new workforce? If we have 500 new nuclear plants, who's going to staff them? Who's going to regulate? There's so many questions that this little dashboard brings up. And if you think about it, I think there's a lot of work and analysis that needs to go into it. But I think this dashboard shows that it's completely feasible. And if we get together as a community, we work together, coordinate, collaborate as a global community, we have a bright future for everyone to have sustainable energy, accessible energy for everyone, and therefore hopefully global prosperity as well.
Well, that sounds like a pretty amazing future. Emma, thank you so much for joining us on Titans of Nuclear.
All right, thank you.
And initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversation if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace.